"She's too old to marry." The auctioneer sneered at the 50-year-old bride until a giant cowboy thundered forward and said, "Not for me." The crowd froze. Dust swirled in the street. A church bell tolled as the woman's dignity was sold for a single silver dollar. But what began as a shocking stand of mercy turned into a fight for survival. Because the cowboy's ranch sits on land everyone wants, the banker, the railroad, and men who will twist the law to break them apart. Now the woman the town mocked as worthless must prove she's the one thing they can't steal: a lawful wife, a keeper of records, and the heart that holds the ranch together. And when forged papers, midnight riders, and a courtroom betrayal threaten to tear it all away, can love that begins in shame become strong enough to save a home and redeem them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Bowers Ridge Town Square, drawing beads of sweat from the gathered crowd. Nora Whitfield stood straight-backed on the rough wooden auction block, her weathered hands clasped tightly before her. Though her heart hammered beneath her faded blue cotton dress, she held her chin high, refusing to let them see her shame. The auctioneer, his vest straining across his belly, circled the platform with exaggerated steps. "Now here's a fine solution to settle them boarding-house debts." He gestured broadly at Nora. "Might be past her prime for bearing young'uns, but she can still cook and clean." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Nora's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Lord, give me strength," she prayed silently. After running the boarding house for 15 years, one bad season and a string of unpaid boarders had brought her to this. "She's too old to marry," the auctioneer declared with a smirk. "But who'll start the bidding? Surely some lonely widower needs a housekeeper." More laughter, sharp as thorns. Nora's fingers trembled where they were laced together, but still she wouldn't bow her head. The town council had decided her fate: auction off the widow Whitfield to cover her debts. As if she were cattle or a piece of furniture, a shadow fell across the platform. The crowd's laughter died as Boaz McAllister stepped forward, his massive frame drawing every eye. Nora had seen him occasionally in town, always keeping to himself. His Apache mother and Scotch-Irish father had left him caught between two worlds, trusted fully by neither. Now he moved with quiet purpose, boots stirring dust from the packed earth. Standing a full 6 feet and 6 inches tall, he removed his broad-brimmed hat with careful courtesy. His voice, when it came, was deep and steady. "Not for me," he said simply. "She's just right." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Boaz reached into his pocket and withdrew a single silver dollar, holding it out to the auctioneer. The coin caught the sunlight, flashing bright. Before anyone could object, Reverend Josiah Bell pushed his way through the crowd, his clerical collar wilted in the heat. "If there's to be a marriage," he declared firmly, "it must be properly done, with vows before God and witnesses." He pulled his worn Bible from his coat pocket. The auctioneer opened his mouth to protest, but the Reverend fixed him with a stern look. "Public vows are binding under both divine and territorial law. You mean to settle debts through marriage? Then let it be a true marriage, sanctified and recorded." Nora's heart fluttered as Boaz stepped onto the platform beside her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his dark eyes, finding there not pity, but a gentle steadiness that made her own spine straighten. "Do you consent to this union, Miss Whitfield?" Reverend Bell asked quietly. Nora swallowed hard, studying the tall man beside her. His clothes were clean but worn, his hands calloused from honest work. Whatever his reasons, he had offered her dignity when others sought to strip it away. "I do consent," she said clearly. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Reverend Bell opened his Bible. The crowd grew still, afternoon heat pressing close around them all. The ceremony was brief but proper, the ancient words ringing out across the square. "I take thee as my wedded wife," Boaz repeated solemnly. "I take thee as my wedded husband," Nora answered, her voice growing stronger. When it was done, Reverend Bell produced his registry book, carefully noting down the details. "I'll have this posted to the county seat by courier straight away," he said. Though they all knew letters took weeks to arrive in these parts, Nora's hands had stopped shaking. Strange how simple words could transform everything, from chattel to wife in the space of moments. She felt Boaz's solid presence beside her like a shield. At the edge of the crowd, she noticed the railroad foreman Harlan Dodd speaking in low tones with Silas Fitch, the banker. Their eyes narrowed at the name McAllister when Reverend Bell spoke it. Their gazes shifted west, toward the fertile lands where Boaz's ranch lay. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as Reverend Bell closed his book. "Best collect your trunk from the sheriff's office, Mrs. McAllister," he said kindly. "Looks like a storm's brewing." The noon train whistle pierced the air, long and lonely. Boaz held out his hand to help Nora down from the platform. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, his grip gentle but sure. Together they stepped down from the auction block, passing through the quickly dispersing crowd toward the livery stable. Nora walked with her head high, no longer a debtor to be sold, but a married woman with restored dignity. Yet she couldn't help noticing how Dodd and Fitch continued watching them, their expressions calculating. The rain began to fall harder, but something told her the real storm was yet to come. Boaz led the way across the muddy street, his long stride shortening to match her pace. They reached the shelter of the livery's broad overhang just as the sky opened up in earnest. The smell of hay and horses filled the dim interior, and somewhere in the darkness a barn cat meowed a greeting. "Your trunk first," Boaz said quietly. "Then home." He spoke the word simply, but Nora felt its weight. Home. Something she'd thought lost forever when the boarding house failed. The rain drummed on the roof as they stood together in the livery doorway, watching sheets of water transform the dusty square into mud. The auction block stood empty now, already beginning to fade like a bad dream. But the reality of what had just occurred settled over Nora like a mantle. She was no longer alone. She glanced up at her new husband's profile, strong and steady against the grey light of the storm. Whatever came next, at least she would face it with dignity restored, standing beside this quiet man who had seen value in her when others saw only debt and age. The train whistle sounded again, fainter now as it pulled away from the station. Its mournful echo hung in the rain-washed air, marking the moment when everything changed, not just for Nora, but for all of Bowers Ridge. Though none watching could have known it then, that simple noon-hour wedding would set in motion events that would transform their entire community. Thunder still growled in the distance as Boaz led the way into the dim livery stable. Lanterns cast dancing shadows across weathered support beams, while the sweet scent of fresh hay mingled with leather and horse. His bay gelding nickered a greeting from its stall, recognizing its master's heavy footsteps on the packed earth floor. "Won't take but a minute to hitch up," Boaz said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the drum of rain on the roof. He moved with practiced efficiency, leading the horse to where a ranch wagon waited. The leather harness creaked as he worked, his large hands gentle despite their strength. Nora stood near the door, her shawl pulled tight against the damp air. "I need to collect my things from the sheriff's office," she said, speaking carefully around the word sheriff. It still stung that her possessions had been seized when the boarding house failed. "We'll go together," Boaz answered, checking the wagon traces one final time. The sheriff's office sat squat and grey in the rain, its windows reflecting the storm clouds above. Inside, Sheriff Mills wouldn't quite meet Nora's eyes as he handed over her remaining possessions: a worn sewing kit, her mother's Bible, and a leather-bound ledger filled with tax receipts and boarding house accounts. "I'm sorry it came to this, Mrs. Whitfield. Mrs. McAllister." The sheriff mumbled, correcting himself. "Weren't right what the council did." Nora's fingers tightened around her Bible. "No," she agreed softly. "It wasn't." She turned away, dignity intact, and followed Boaz back into the rain. Their next stop was the parsonage, a modest white clapboard house beside the church. Reverend Bell welcomed them into his study, where a pot-bellied stove fought back the storm's chill. With careful penmanship, he entered their names in the church registry. "I'll send a telegram to the county clerk before sundown," the Reverend promised, dipping his pen in ink. "Best to have everything properly recorded." He looked up, his kind eyes serious. "Telegrams arrive same day. The marriage will be legal and binding before nightfall." Boaz nodded his thanks, then gestured toward the door. "Need to stop at Whitaker's store before we head home." "Running low on supplies." "At the general store, mister." Whitaker measured out flour and coffee while thunder crashed outside. When Boaz asked to put it on credit, the shopkeeper glanced nervously toward his office door before lowering his voice. "Watch yourself, McAllister. Silas Fitch was in here yesterday, asking questions about your spring. He tied up the paper packages with string. Said something about railroad water rights." "Much obliged for the warning." Boaz replied quietly, gathering their supplies. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the time they left town. The wagon wheels cut deep ruts in the muddy road as they headed west. Dust turned to spatter against their clothes. Neither spoke much, letting the creak of wood and leather fill the silence. After an hour's travel, they stopped at a clear running stream to water the horse. While the animal drank deeply, Boaz stood looking across the rolling prairie, his expression thoughtful. "My mother's people, the Apache, they taught me about this land," he said finally. "About sharing pasture and water, taking only what you need." He gestured toward the stream. "Water gives life to everything out here. Some folks understand that. Others." He shook his head. "Others see only profit." Nora watched a pair of meadowlarks dart across the grass, their yellow breasts bright against the grey sky. "Your mother taught you well, then?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That she did." They continued on as afternoon faded toward evening. The sun broke briefly through the clouds, painting the wet prairie in gold just as a weathered ranch house came into view. Two men stood on the porch, waving as the wagon approached. Smoke rose straight and true from the chimney, and lamplight gleamed welcome through the windows. "That's Levi and Tom," Boaz explained, guiding the wagon into the yard. "Good men. They work the ranch with me." The two hands helped unload the wagon, then took care of the horse while Boaz showed Nora inside. The house was plain but clean, with a stone fireplace and simple furnishings. A pot of beans simmered on the cook stove, and fresh bread sat cooling on the table. "Tom's a fair hand with sourdough," Boaz said, hanging his wet coat by the door. "Usually share meals together, all of us." Supper was simple, but filling, the beans hot and the bread still warm. Levi and Tom kept the conversation light, careful to make Nora feel welcome without prying. When the meal was done, Boaz showed her to a small bedroom off the main room. "It ain't much," he said apologetically, "but it's yours. I'll sleep in the lean-to out back." After the dishes were washed and put away, an unexpected peace settled over the house. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a chorus of dripping eaves and distant coyote song. Without discussion, they gathered near the hearth, where embers still glowed orange in the growing dark. Nora opened her Bible, its familiar weight comforting in her hands. For the first time in months, she felt calm enough for proper prayer. As she knelt, Boaz quietly joined her, his large frame somehow gentle in the firelight. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the ridge, their wild voices rising and falling like an evening hymn. In that moment, kneeling beside this quiet man who had saved her from humiliation, Nora felt the first stirrings of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. Their marriage might have started as an act of kindness, but as she whispered her prayers in the gathering dusk, she sensed it growing into something more, a true partnership, forged in adversity but strengthened by mutual respect. The coyotes sang on, their melody weaving through the peace of their first evening together, while the last light faded from the western sky. The first rays of sunrise crept through the kitchen window, painting golden stripes across the worn plank table. Nora moved quietly, not wanting to wake the household as she kindled the cook-stove fire. The familiar routine of measuring coffee grounds brought comfort after yesterday's upheaval. While the coffee perked, her eye caught scattered papers on the table's far end. Homestead filings and water rights documents lay jumbled, some corners curling, others marked with coffee rings. Her fingers itched to bring order to the chaos. After pouring herself a cup, she began sorting through the papers. Land claims, water agreements, and property boundaries, all critical documents, all in disarray. With practiced efficiency, she arranged them by date, smoothing dog-eared corners and stacking them neatly. A length of faded ribbon from her sewing kit served to tie them together. Through the window, she watched Boaz in the corral, his tall frame dwarfing the nervous mare he worked with. His movements were slow and deliberate, one hand extended with patience while he spoke in low tones. The horse's ears flicked forward, then back, uncertain but listening. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to a rider approaching from the east. The man sat his horse with easy grace, his dark hair caught back with a band, his manner alert but peaceful. As he drew closer, she noticed he wore a mix of Army Scout and traditional Navajo clothing. Boaz looked up and raised a hand in greeting. "Ben, didn't expect you till next week. The supply train runs early," Ben Yazzie replied, dismounting. He carried a package wrapped in cloth. "Brought jerky. My sister's making." His eyes caught movement by the kitchen door where Nora stood. "Ah, you have company?" "My wife," Boaz said, the words still new on his tongue. "Nora, this is Ben Yazzie. He scouts for Fort Lewis, rides message between posts sometimes. Good friend." Ben inclined his head respectfully. "Welcome to the ranch, Mrs. McAllister." "Thank you, Mr. Yazzie. Would you care for coffee? It's fresh made." "Much obliged," Ben said, following her into the kitchen. His sharp eyes took in the neat stack of papers. "I see you bring order already." "Just trying to sort things properly," Nora replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. Ben nodded approvingly. "Army posts, reservation agencies, they live by paper rules. Every form filed right, every T crossed. Small thing, but it matters." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Speaking of boundaries, saw railroad survey stakes on my ride-in, creeping closer to McAllister Spring." Boaz entered, wiping dust from his hands. "How close?" 2 miles east, moving steady. They mark their claim bold with red flags. Nora listened while she moved about the kitchen, setting things in order. Years of running a boarding house had taught her the comfort of routine. She swept the main room, straightened chairs, opened windows to let in fresh air. When Levi appeared with a torn sleeve, she threaded a needle and mended it with quick, neat stitches. By noon, savory stew bubbled on the stove, its aroma drawing the men in from their morning work. They sat around the table, passing cornbread and trading news of neighboring ranches. The easy fellowship reminded Nora of better days at her boarding house before debt and whispered judgment had stolen her dignity. During a lull in conversation, Boaz spoke quietly. Been fighting shadows since I was a boy. Some folks see my Apache blood, decide they know all they need to know. His eyes met Nora's. Reckon you understand something about being judged wrong. Too old, they said yesterday. Nora replied, her voice steady, as if years lived somehow made me worth less. Ben set down his spoon. I can help. Have watched this ranch grow under your care, Boaz. Every improvement noted, every water right respected. My word carries weight with army records. I will testify if needed. After the meal, they saddled horses to ride the fence line. Nora hadn't been on horseback in years, but the gentle mare Boaz chose for her proved patient. The afternoon sun warmed their backs as they followed the property boundaries, checking posts and wire. True to Ben's warning, red survey flags fluttered in the distance, like bright birds of prey watching and waiting. Nora studied Boaz's face as he stared at those markers. His expression remained calm, but she saw tension in the set of his jaw. They returned as evening painted the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Ben departed with promises to return soon, leaving them with his sister's jerky and his pledge of support. Levi and Tom retired to the bunkhouse after supper, their good nights carrying easily in the quiet air. In the kitchen, Nora washed the last dishes while Boaz dried them, their movements falling into natural rhythm. When the work was done, they stood for a moment in the doorway, watching stars appear above the darkening plains. Thank you, Boaz said softly, for bringing order to my scattered papers. And everything else. Thank you, Nora replied, for giving me the chance to be useful again. They parted there at the kitchen door, each to their separate rooms, yet each feeling the first tender threads of true partnership forming between them. Neither charity nor pity had brought them together, but rather mutual respect and growing understanding. As Nora prepared for bed, she heard coyotes singing on the ridge again, their wild chorus a reminder that even in the vastness of the frontier, no one had to face the darkness alone. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate brushstrokes of pink and gold as Nora and Boaz prepared for their journey to town. The morning air held a hint of coming rain, and wisps of fog clung to the lowlands near the creek. Best get an early start, Boaz said, lifting the heavy wagon harness. It's a fair piece to the county seat. Nora nodded, securing a basket of bread and cheese for their midday meal. She had risen before sunrise to pack provisions, knowing the importance of today's task. Her carefully organized papers sat wrapped in oilcloth, protected from dust and damp. The horses stamped impatiently as Boaz hitched them to the wagon. Tom and Levi emerged from the bunkhouse to help, checking the traces and wheel hubs. Mind those ruts past Cottonwood Creek, Tom warned, adjusting a leather strap. Spring rains cut them deeper this year. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when they set out, the wagon creaking beneath them. Nora held tight to the seat as they navigated the rutted trail. The familiar weight of her ledger pressed against her side, tucked securely in her cloth bag. About 2 hours into their journey, a worrying rattle developed in the rear wheel. Boaz pulled the team to a halt, frowning at the sound. Wheel's working loose, he said, climbing down. Best tend it now before we have real trouble. While Boaz tightened the wheel with tools from under the seat, Nora stretched her legs, watching meadowlarks dart through the morning air. The delay was frustrating, but she understood frontier travel demanded patience. They reached town by mid-morning, the streets already busy with wagons and riders. Boaz helped Nora down from the high seat, his large hand steady and sure. Together they climbed the courthouse steps, boot heels echoing on worn wooden boards. Inside, County Clerk Amos Rawlins sat at his desk, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up as they approached, recognition flickering across his face. "Ah, the McAllisters," he said, shuffling through papers. "Got Reverend Bell's telegram right here." He held up a yellow paper slip, official stamps clearly visible. And his church register entry arrived by morning post. "We'd like to file formally," Nora said, her voice clear and steady. Rawlins nodded, dipping his pen. "Official license will come by mail. Takes a few weeks to process through Denver, but everything's proper and witnessed." The stamp came down with satisfying finality. They moved next to the land office window, where Nora produced her boarding house tax ledger. The pages showed neat columns of figures, each payment carefully recorded. "I believe in keeping proper accounts," she said, laying the book open. "Every debt paid, every receipt saved." The clerk examined her careful penmanship with obvious approval. Boaz then spread out his water rights documentation, the pages Nora had tied so neatly, showing years of legitimate claims to McAllister Spring. A shadow fell across the counter. Banker Silas Fitch stood watching, railroad agent Harlan Dodd at his shoulder. They whispered to notary Caleb Birch, who shuffled through the McAllisters' papers with exaggerated care. "Seems we're missing a page," Birch announced, though Nora was certain all documents had been present moments before. "And these survey marks need verification. Perhaps we should telegraph the state office." "That could take weeks," Dodd added, poorly concealing his satisfaction. Before Nora could protest, heavy boots sounded on the floorboards. Reverend Josiah Bell strode in, his weathered Bible tucked under one arm. "I witnessed their vows myself," he declared, voice firm as old oak. "And I'll sign an affidavit this minute testifying to it." He fixed Fitch with a steady gaze. "Before God and the law." Rawlins cleared his throat. "Well then, let's schedule a proper hearing. 1 week from today, we'll settle any questions about these claims." He wrote in his calendar with deliberate strokes. 10 o'clock sharp, next Thursday morning. Fitch's face tightened, but he kept his voice smooth. "We look forward to it. Come along, Dodd." As they left the courthouse, the sky had darkened with approaching storm clouds. Boaz helped Nora into the wagon just as the first fat drops began to fall. "Best take it slow," he said, gathering the reins. "Roads'll be slick." They drove homeward at a careful pace, the wagon wheels leaving deep tracks in the softening dirt. Lightning forked across the sky above distant mesas, followed by rolling thunder. Through the curtain of rain, Nora caught a glimpse of movement, a man in a slicker, half hidden among the rocks, watching their departure. She said nothing, but felt Boaz tense beside her. He had seen it too. They continued on through the strengthening storm, each lost in thought about the battles that lay ahead. The rain fell steadily now, drumming on the wagon's canvas cover. Water dripped from the horses' manes as they plodded forward, heads lowered against the weather. Behind them, the watcher in his rain gear remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the storm-grey sky. Sunday dawned bright and clear, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Inside the kitchen, Nora hummed softly as she measured cornmeal into a bowl. The familiar motions of baking brought comfort, and the simple task of creating something wholesome for others filled her with quiet joy. She had risen early to sweep the floors and arrange wild flowers in tin cans along the windowsills. Now, as she worked the cornbread batter, the sound of wagon wheels crunching on gravel drifted through the open window. Reverend Bell's mule-drawn buggy appeared first, followed by several ranch wagons carrying curious neighbors. "Smells mighty fine in here," Boaz said, ducking through the doorway. His eyes softened at the sight of the gingham curtains Nora had hung the day before, bringing cheerful color to the weathered walls. "Just simple cornbread," she replied. but pleasure warmed her voice. "Would you set these chairs out on the porch?" Soon the morning air filled with the sound of hymn singing. Reverend Bell's strong tenor led "Amazing Grace," while children darted between the adults' legs, chasing chickens that scattered in noisy protest. Tom's daughter Ruthie shrieked with delight as a speckled hen flapped past. "Careful now," Tom called, but he was grinning, clearly happy to see his child at play. Levy lounged against a porch post, his usual worry lines smoothed away by the festive atmosphere. He nodded appreciatively as the aroma of baking cornbread wafted from the kitchen. The crunch of hooves announced Ben Yazzy's arrival. He dismounted smoothly, leading his paint horse to the water trough. From his saddlebags he produced fresh coffee beans and an official-looking paper. "Delivery receipt from Fort Lewis," he explained, handing it to Boaz. "Shows your good standing with the Army supply contract." Could help at the hearing. Boaz accepted the document with quiet thanks, carefully adding it to Nora's organized files. More wagons arrived, bringing families from neighboring homesteads. Some hung back uncertainly, but the smell of food and sound of singing drew them closer. Nora emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, and her cheeks were flushed from the cookstove's heat. Boaz straightened his shoulders, pride evident in his stance. "Folks," he said, his deep voice carrying across the yard, "I'd like you to meet my bride, Nora. She's the heart of this ranch now." His usual reserve melted as he gazed at her. "And I'm mighty blessed she chose to stay." A murmur of greeting rose from the gathered neighbors. Ben Yazzie stepped forward, raising his hands in blessing. In measured tones, he offered a traditional Navajo prayer for harmony, his words carrying ancient wisdom about balance between earth and sky, people and land. When he finished, Reverend Bell opened his Bible. "If it be possible," he read, "as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men." His weathered finger traced the verse. Romans chapter 12, verse 18. Nora set out bowls of hearty stew and plates of golden cornbread. The porch boards creaked as people found seats, sharing food and cautious conversation. Children balanced plates on their knees, sauce dripping despite mother's warnings. To her own surprise, Nora found herself laughing at Levi's tale of a stubborn mule. The sound startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed so freely. Her hands stayed busy, passing plates and refilling cups, but her eyes shone with genuine happiness. As the meal wound down, Boaz touched her elbow. "Got something for you?" he said softly. From his pocket, he drew out a simple silver locket. The metal caught the sunlight as he placed it in her palm. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside, pressed carefully between the halves, lay a sprig of wild mint. The fresh, sweet scent released as she opened it brought tears to her eyes, not of sorrow, but of hope. New beginnings, she thought, like the first green shoots after winter. "It's perfect," she whispered, letting him fasten the chain around her neck. Reverend Bell called everyone together for a final hymn. "Shall We Gather at the River?" Floated across the ranch yard, voices blending in rough harmony. Even the most skeptical neighbors found themselves humming along, feet tapping to the familiar tune. As afternoon shadows lengthened, wagons began pulling out. Children were lifted aboard, sleepy and content. Promises to return were exchanged, handshakes offered with growing warmth. The last wagon disappeared around the bend, wheels rattling over rocks, horse hooves kicking up small dust clouds that caught the setting sun. Stars began appearing in the deepening blue sky, first one, then dozens, then hundreds. Crickets tuned up their evening chorus from the grass. Boaz and Nora settled onto the porch bench, shoulders touching lightly. The day's warmth lingered in the wooden boards beneath their feet. Neither spoke for a long while, content to watch night settle over their land. Nora's fingers absently traced the outline of the locket, the mint's faint sweetness still detectable. Boaz's quiet breathing matched the rhythm of the cricket's song. In that moment, it seemed possible that their troubles might pass them by, that the peace of this Sunday gathering might stretch forward into all their days. The evening air carried the lingering scent of cornbread and coffee, of mint and hope, of a home finding its heart. The clock's midnight chime had barely faded when 3 sharp blows rattled the ranch house door. The sound echoed through the quiet rooms like thunderclaps. Nora jerked awake in her small bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the thin walls she heard Boaz's heavy footsteps and the scratch of a match as he lit the coal oil lamp. "Who comes at this hour?" Boaz's deep voice carried clearly through the door. "Deputy Boone, with legal papers to serve." The response came clipped and formal, lacking Eli's usual easy manner. Nora pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped into the main room just as Boaz opened the door. The lamplight spilled across the threshold, illuminating Deputy Eli Boone's troubled face. Behind him loomed 2 unfamiliar men, their forms half hidden in shadow. The metallic glint of gun belts caught the light. Eli avoided meeting their eyes as he pulled a rolled document from his vest. Without speaking, he produced a hammer and nail from his pocket. The sharp crack of metal on wood made Nora flinch as he tacked the paper to the doorframe. "By order of Judge Theodore Wade," Eli recited woodenly, "a temporary injunction has been granted regarding occupation of this property." He swallowed hard. "Based on expert testimony that the claimed marriage fails to meet homestead inheritance requirements due to the advanced age of the party, Nora Whitfield." Nora's fingers pressed against her throat where the new locket lay. The mint sprig's sweet scent seemed to mock her now. She lifted her chin, refusing to show these men how deeply the words cut. Boaz's massive frame filled the doorway, but his voice remained steady. "This paper carries Silas Fitch's stink all over it." One of the shadowed men shifted, hand dropping to his holster. "Watch your tone, half-breed." "I'm under orders," Eli muttered, his face flushed with shame. "Have to serve these papers proper." "Then they're served," Boaz replied. "But we'll be keeping our home." The second stranger took a step forward, spurs jingling. "Might be easier if you just cleared out quiet-like." "Might be," Boaz agreed mildly. "But we won't." Tension crackled in the midnight air. Nora could see the stranger's hands hovering near their single-action pistols, eager for an excuse. But Boaz remained still, projecting calm strength rather than reaching for a weapon. After a long moment, Eli cleared his throat. "Papers are served legal now. We'll be going." He touched his hat brim, a ghost of his usual courtesy. "Got my orders, you understand." The 3 men mounted up, their horses' hooves muffled in the dust as they rode away. Only then did Nora realize she'd been holding her breath. Her hands trembled as she carefully unpinned the notice from the door frame. Boaz set the lamp on the kitchen table, its yellow light creating a small circle of warmth in the dark room. They bent their heads together over the document, reading the formal language that threatened to steal their home. The lamp's flame wavered with their quick, anxious breaths. A soft knock announced Ben Yaz's arrival from the bunkhouse. He must have heard the commotion. "Trouble?" he asked simply, taking in their grave faces. "Fitch found himself an expert to claim I'm too old for a legal marriage," Nora said, voice bitter. "Says it invalidates Boaz's homestead rights." Ben's weathered face creased in thought as he studied the paper. This is hollow as a dry gourd. Age cannot void a proper marriage. But he paused, choosing his words carefully. Hollow claims can still be dangerous when backed by money and influence. "What's our best path?" Boaz asked. Not guns. Ben said firmly. That's what they want. An excuse to call you dangerous. No, this fight needs papers and witnesses and telegrams. Laws may bend for men like Fitch, but they can't break completely if enough honest folks stand witness. Nora straightened her shoulders, determination replacing fear. Then that's what we'll do. She retrieved her small writing desk, setting out paper and ink with precise movements. The familiar tools helped steady her hands. While the men talked quietly by the stove, she began making lists in her neat handwriting. Reverend Bell's marriage record and telegram to the county clerk. Ben's Fort Lewis delivery receipts showing Boaz's good standing. The tax ledger proving her own business sense. They would need certified copies of everything. The hours crept past midnight toward dawn. Roosters began their morning chorus as Nora finally set down her pen. She had created order from chaos, clear lists of what they needed and who must be contacted. Moving to the cook stove, she stirred the banked coals to life, adding kindling for breakfast. Her face was set with quiet determination, like flint ready to strike sparks. Behind her, she could hear Boaz pulling on his boots, preparing to ride into town as soon as there was light enough to see the trail. They had chosen their path, not violence, but vigilance, not bullets, but the patient building of truth upon truth until justice prevailed. As the first pale light crept over the eastern mesas, Nora touched the locket at her throat, drawing strength from its promise of new beginnings. Boaz paused in the doorway, hat in hand. I'll send those telegrams first thing and see Reverend Bell. Nora nodded, her movements sure and steady as she measured coffee into the pot. We'll show them that truth doesn't age out of power. She managed a small smile. And that this old woman still has fight in her. The sun's edge peeked over the horizon as Boaz's horse trotted down the trail toward town. Nora watched until he disappeared around the bend, then turned back to her morning tasks. They had chosen law and faith over violence. Now they would see that choice through, no matter what came. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Boaz strode purposefully toward the clerk's office. The heavy wooden floorboards creaked beneath his boots, echoing in the quiet hallway. He carried Nora's neatly written protest in one hand, the paper crisp and official-looking, despite being drafted at their kitchen table before dawn. Reverend Josiah Bell met him on the courthouse steps, his weathered Bible tucked under one arm. The preacher's usually gentle face wore an expression of stern determination. "Brother McAllister," he said, grasping Boaz's hand firmly. "I've already begun drafting my sworn statement. The Lord knows I won't stand idle while injustice tries to tear apart a sacred union." Inside the clerk's office, the Reverend spread his papers across the worn counter. His quill scratched steadily as he detailed the marriage ceremony, listing the names of congregation members who had witnessed the vows. He included precise dates and times, even noting the weather and position of the sun, details that spoke to the clarity of his memory and the gravity of his testimony. "I've served this territory for 15 years, Reverend Bell said as he signed his name with a flourish. "My word carries weight with honest folk, and this statement will stand against any man's lies." While the Reverend worked, Boaz crossed the street to the telegraph office. The operator's fingers clicked out 3 urgent messages, one to the state land office in Denver, another to the county surveyor, and a third to the territorial registrar. Each telegram laid out their case in terse, economical words that would cost precious coins to transmit. Ben Yazzie had already mounted up, ready to ride out and check the railroad's encroachment. "I'll scout those survey stakes," he told Boaz, "but mind you, I won't set foot on reservation land without proper permission. Those agency rules matter, especially now when we need everything done proper and legal." Boaz nodded, understanding how crucial it was to follow every regulation to the letter. They couldn't afford to give Fitch or his railroad friends any excuse to challenge their standing. At the Fort Lewis agency office, Nora sat straight-backed in a hard wooden chair while Mr. Tomlin, the agency clerk, shuffled through his files. Her fingers worried at the edge of her shawl, but her voice remained steady as she requested official confirmation of Ben's status and copies of the Army's supply receipts showing Boaz's long-standing presence on the land. These delivery records go back 5 years. Mr. Tomlin mused, adjusting his spectacles. All properly signed and witnessed. Shows regular improvements to the property too. New fencing, cleared fields, repaired spring house. He began making careful copies, his pen scratching across the heavy paper. The sun had climbed high overhead by the time Nora and Boaz reunited at the land office. They spread their growing collection of documents across a scarred wooden table, making duplicate copies of every page. Nora's fingers flew over the papers, her handwriting clear and precise despite the urgency of their task. "Even if they destroy one set, we'll have others," she said, carefully folding the copies and tucking them into her sewing box. The familiar container, usually filled with threads and needles, now held their hopes for justice. The afternoon stretched long as they worked, the scratch of pens and rustle of paper accompanied by the distant whistle of trains. Finally, as shadows began to lengthen across the floor, they gathered their precious documents and headed home. The wagon rolled steadily along the rutted road, neither of them speaking much. They stopped at Cottonwood Creek to rest the horses, listening to the water's gentle murmur while the team drank deeply. The peaceful scene stood in sharp contrast to the tension they both felt. Dusk was settling over the ranch when they arrived home. Levi met them at the barn, his usual easy manner replaced by worried tension. "Saw riders near the spring today," he reported in a low voice. "3 of them, watching the place." They didn't come closer, but they were there a good while. Inside the ranch house, lamplight cast warm circles on the wooden floors. Nora moved with quiet purpose, gathering their precious affidavits and copies. She pinned the papers carefully into a folded piece of oilcloth, making sure each corner was secure. The flour bin scraped softly against the floor as she pulled it away from the wall. Kneeling, she slid the protected documents into the hidden space beneath, then carefully shifted the heavy bin back into place. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as she bowed her head. "Lord," she prayed aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "let truth stand firm against all falsehood. Guard these papers that speak honest words and guide us in the path of justice." The flame in the lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the kitchen walls. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the darkening range, but inside the ranch house, Nora and Boaz had laid their foundation of truth, document by careful document, ready to stand against whatever storm might come. The hour was late when Ben Yazzie finally returned from his scouting ride. His tired horse plodded into the barn where Boaz waited to hear his report. Their quiet voices drifted through the evening air, mapping out the next day's challenges. But for now, they had done all they could, gathered their evidence, sent their messages, and placed their trust in the power of honest words properly witnessed. The dry wind scraped across the ranch yard, rattling the weathered shingles and stirring up dust devils that danced between the fence posts. Nora gripped the well rope, muscles straining as she drew up the bucket. When it finally broke the surface, her heart sank. The water barely covered the bottom. "Getting mighty low," she called to Boaz, who stood examining the cloudless sky with concerned eyes. He nodded, squinting against the harsh morning light. "We'll need to move some cattle down to the river tomorrow." "Can't risk losing any to thirst." His voice carried the weight of a rancher's constant worry about water. Inside the kitchen, Tom's daughter Ruthie sat at the rough wooden table, pushing her breakfast around her plate. The 8-year-old had been staying with Nora while her widowed father helped with the cattle. Her usually bright eyes looked dull, and a flush colored her cheeks. "You feeling all right, child?" Nora pressed a gentle hand to Ruthie's forehead and drew back in alarm at the heat she found there. Before sunrise the next morning, Boaz and the hands set out with a small herd, moving slowly to avoid tiring the cattle in the growing heat. The careful work of guiding thirsty animals toward water required patience and steady nerves. Back at the ranch house, Ruthie's fever climbed higher. The girl tossed restlessly on her bed, her dark hair damp with sweat. Nora wrung out cool cloths in the precious well water, laying them across the child's burning forehead and the pulse points at her wrists. "There now, sweet girl," Nora murmured, smoothing back Ruthie's tangled hair. She kept up a steady stream of soft words and hymns, all while watching the sun crawl across the sky through the bedroom window. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard brought her to the door. Ben Yazzie dismounted quickly, a leather pouch hanging from his saddle horn. "I rode to speak with Grandmother Yazzie," he explained, following Nora inside. "She sent these healing plants, juniper and willow bark." In the kitchen, Ben laid out the dried herbs with careful reverence. "The juniper helps clear the breath," he explained, demonstrating how to measure the proper amount. "The willow bark tea must steep exactly so. Too strong will upset her stomach. Too weak won't help the fever." Nora listened intently, noting how Ben's hands moved with practiced precision as he showed her the proper way to prepare the medicine. His respect for the traditional knowledge was evident in every careful gesture. "Your grandmother is generous to share her wisdom," Nora said softly, measuring the herbs exactly as shown. Ben nodded. "She says all healing comes from the holy people, meant to be shared with those in need." He watched as Nora strained the tea into a cup. "Just a few sips at first, to see how she takes to it." Through the long afternoon, Nora coaxed small amounts of the healing tea into Ruthie, all while keeping up the cool cloths and quiet prayers. The child's breathing gradually became less labored, her restless movements calming. Outside, Levi worked steadily at repairing the empty water trough, the sharp ring of his hammer punctuating the heavy afternoon air. The sound of approaching cattle announced Boaz's return, his tall form dust-covered but relieved as he dismounted. "Got them all down to drink safe," he reported, coming to check on Ruthie. "How's our girl?" "The fever's breaking," Nora said, touching the child's cooler forehead. Ben brought medicine from his grandmother. It helped turn the tide. Ruthie's eyes fluttered open, clearer now. "I'm hungry," she whispered. "That's the best medicine of all." Nora smiled, squeezing the girl's hand. The sun was setting when they heard a horse approaching at a steady lope. The rider, one of the clerk's assistants from town, carried a folded notice sealed with wax. Boaz read it by the last light of day, his expression grave. "County hearing is set for Friday at noon," he announced. "That gives us 2 days to get our final papers in order." Nora nodded, already mentally preparing for tomorrow's early start. "We'll need the wagon at first light," she said. "Every document must be perfect." As night settled over the ranch, the breeze turned cool, carrying the distant song of coyotes. Nora left the bedroom door cracked open so she could hear Ruthie's now steady breathing from the kitchen, where she sat organizing their papers. The day's trials had only strengthened her determination. Watching over Ruthie, seeing how Ben's grandmother's wisdom had helped heal the child, feeling the support of their small but loyal family, it all reinforced what they were fighting to protect. This wasn't just about land and water rights anymore. It was about preserving a place where different traditions could come together in respect, where mercy and competence knew no boundaries of age or culture. Nora squared her shoulders, checking once more on the sleeping child before returning to her preparations. The hearing would test them all, but today had proven they were stronger together than apart. Her resolve hardened like steel as she sorted through their precious documents, each one a weapon of truth against those who would try to take what was rightfully theirs. Friday morning dawned steel grey and cool, the sun barely breaking through thick clouds. Nora sat straight-backed on the wagon seat beside Boaz, her precious oilcloth bundle of documents held securely in her lap. The freshly greased wheels turned smoothly over the rutted road toward town, each revolution bringing them closer to their moment of truth. "Records all secure?" Boaz asked quietly, glancing at the bundle in her arms. "Everything in its place," Nora assured him, patting the carefully organized papers. "Every receipt, every filing, every telegram confirmation, all here and in order." They reached Bowers Ridge just as the courthouse bell tolled 10. Already townspeople clustered on the wooden sidewalks, watching with undisguised interest as Boaz helped Nora down from the wagon. Ben Yazzie sat his horse nearby, nodding gravely in greeting. Reverend Bell stood waiting at the courthouse steps, his worn Bible tucked under one arm and his church register held carefully in the other. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. The space smelled of wood polish and wool suits, with morning light filtering through tall windows. Judge Thaddeus Merriweather's bench loomed at the front, solid oak speaking to the weight of law. The judge himself, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, studied papers before him as people filed in. Silas Fitch sat at the front table in a fine black coat, looking every inch the prosperous banker. His notary, Caleb Birch, nervously shuffled papers beside him, while Harlan Dodd lounged against the rail with affected casualness. The railroad agent's smirk made Nora's spine stiffen, but she kept her face calm as she and Boaz took their seats. "All rise," called the clerk as Judge Merriweather straightened his robes. "The County Court of Bowers Ridge is now in session, the Honorable Judge Thaddeus Merriweather presiding." "Be seated," the judge instructed, peering over his spectacles at the assembled crowd. "We are here to address the matter of water rights and property claims regarding McAllister Spring and associated lands. Mr. Birch, you may present your client's case." Caleb Birch stood, tugging at his collar. "Your Honor, I present a corrected deed showing prior claim to the water rights in question." He approached the bench with a crisp document. "Furthermore, we have evidence that Mr. McAllister's subsequent filings were submitted well after the prescribed deadline." The judge examined the deed carefully while Fitch sat back with a satisfied expression. Dodd's boot tapped an impatient rhythm against the floor. "Reverend Bell," Judge Merriweather called, "you have documents to present?" "I do, Your Honor." The preacher rose, his voice steady. "I have here the original church register showing the legitimate marriage of Boaz McAllister and Nora Whitfield, properly witnessed and recorded." He laid the book on the judge's desk. Additionally, these telegram confirmations verify timely notification to all relevant officers. Ben Yazzie stepped forward next, his bearing dignified. "I can testify to Mr. McAllister's continuous improvement of this land over many years," he stated clearly. "As a scout for Fort Lewis, I have regularly observed his responsible management of the water source and grazing areas. The Army supply records will confirm our dealings." The judge nodded slowly, comparing dates between documents. Nora noticed his frown deepen as he held the corrected deed up to the light. "Mrs. McAllister," he said suddenly, "please approach and explain these ledger entries." Nora walked forward, her worn account book open to carefully ruled pages. "Your Honor, I have maintained detailed records throughout my years running the boarding house," she explained, her voice clear and steady. "Each entry is dated and noted with receipts for taxes paid. You'll see here the consistent pattern of my record keeping." The judge compared her neat columns to other documents before him. His frown deepened as he examined a seal on Birch's deed. "This seal appears irregular," he announced. "I believe we need verification from the state office." He turned to his clerk. "Send an immediate telegram to the state land office. Request confirmation of the deed's authenticity and filing dates." The clerk hurried out while tension crackled in the courtroom. Fitch's face had lost some of its confidence, and Birch was sweating visibly now. "Deputy Boone," the judge continued, addressing Eli where he stood by the door, "until this matter is fully resolved, you will ensure there are no attempts at eviction or interference with the McAllister property. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eli replied, standing straighter, relief visible in his bearing. "This court stands in recess until we receive the state office response," Judge Merriweather declared, bringing down his gavel. "All parties are to maintain peace in the meantime." Outside, the sky had darkened ominously. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Boaz and Nora loaded the wagon for home. The air felt heavy with moisture, tasting of metal and approaching rain. "Storm's coming fast," Boaz observed, helping Nora to her seat. "Best we get moving." They were barely a mile out when the rain hit, falling in heavy sheets that turned the road to mud. The wagon lurched in deepening ruts, and suddenly a sharp crack split the air. "Wheels gone!" Boaz called over the downpour, already jumping down to examine the damage. The back wheel had split clean through, leaving them stranded in the deluge. Working together in the rain, they managed to prop the broken axle with a sapling Boaz cut from the roadside. The makeshift repair would have to hold until they reached home. "Slow and steady," Boaz said, helping Nora back up. Both were soaked to the skin now, clothes heavy with rain. The wagon crept forward at a snail's pace, the good wheels slipping in mud while thunder boomed overhead. Lightning split the sky in brilliant forks, illuminating the rain-swept landscape in stark flashes. Finally, the ranch house emerged through the curtain of rain. They guided the tired team into the stable, where Boaz quickly unhitched them while Nora gathered their sodden papers. They burst through the front door just as another thunderclap shook the windows. Water pooled around their feet on the plank floor as they stood dripping in the entryway. The decision might be deferred, but they were home, together. And hope still burned bright despite the storm's fury. Nora clutched the oilcloth bundle, somehow still dry inside despite their drenching. "The papers are safe," she said, managing a smile through chattering teeth. Thunder rolled again across the hills, but within their sturdy walls they had shelter from the storm, and from those who would take it from them. The judge's scrutiny of Fitch's forged deed had cracked the banker's smooth facade. For now, that would have to be enough. The storm raged through the night, hurling sleet against the ranch house shutters with startling force. The strange early cold snap turned everything to ice, coating windows and fence posts alike. Inside, lamplight flickered as wind moaned through every crack and crevice, making the flames dance in the hearth. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a world glazed in crystalline white. The morning light caught each ice-coated branch and transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and sharp. But there was work to be done, regardless of weather's whims. In the barn, Levi worked steadily on the broken wagon wheel, his breath visible in the cold air. He had managed to salvage most of the original wood, carefully resetting the spokes and rim. The methodical tap of his hammer echoed across the yard, keeping time with the drip of melting ice. Inside the ranch house, Nora spread their precious documents carefully beside the warming stove, positioning each page just close enough to dry without risking scorching. Her fingers smoothed every wrinkled edge with gentle precision, ensuring the papers would lie flat when fully dried. These documents represented more than just legal claims. They were the foundation of their future. Boaz paced near the window, his tall frame casting shifting shadows in the morning light. Something had been weighing on him, evident in the set of his shoulders and the furrow of his brow. Finally, he turned to Nora, his voice low and heavy with long-carried burden. "There's something you should know," he began, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Something I did when I was younger. Barely more than a boy, really." Nora set aside her work and sat across from him, her quiet presence encouraging him to continue. "I used to scout for the army," he said, his eyes fixed on his weathered hands. "Showed them water sources, trails, terrain. Never carried a weapon. Told myself I was just helping map the land." He drew a deep breath. "Then I heard about a camp downstream from one of those water sources. Soldiers burned it out. No warning, no mercy." His voice grew hoarse. "I never raised a rifle, never struck a blow, but I showed them the way. Those people, they trusted that water source, same as we trust our spring. The ash of that camp, it sits here." He pressed a fist to his chest. "Can't seem to shake it loose." Nora reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "The Lord can take any vessel, no matter how cracked, and make it into something new," she said softly. "Look at what you've built here, a place of shelter, of peace. You're not that same young man anymore." Ben Yazzie, who had been quietly drinking coffee by the stove, spoke up. "In my people's way, we say a warrior's greatest victory is not in fighting, but in bringing harmony." He set his cup down thoughtfully. "Making water flow where it's needed, keeping peace between neighbors. These are the true tests of a man's strength." The morning wore on as the ice began to melt. By afternoon, the sky finally broke open, revealing patches of clear blue between the clouds. Boaz and Nora decided to ride out and check on McAllister Spring, knowing the sudden freeze might have affected the flow. They rode side by side, their horses picking their way carefully across the thawing ground. As they approached the spring, fresh tracks in the mud caught their attention, boot prints and measuring marks in the soft earth around the water's edge. "Someone's been checking the flow," Boaz observed, dismounting to examine the marks more closely. "Fitch's men, most likely," Nora replied, scanning the surrounding ridgeline. Instead of posting guards or making threats, they simply stayed present. Boaz checked the spring's flow while Nora recorded the water levels in her ledger. Their quiet industry served as its own kind of protection, a demonstration of careful stewardship rather than force. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when they finally turned toward home. They rode at an easy pace, watching the sunset paint the storm clouds in brilliant golds and purples. The air had lost its bitter edge, promising a gentler night ahead. Back at the ranch house, warmth and light spilled from the windows. The evening meal brought everyone together around the long table. Boaz and Nora, Ben, Levi, and Tom, even little Ruthie, fully recovered from her fever. The simple food tasted rich after the long day's work. As the last dishes were cleared away, someone began to hum softly. The tune caught on, and soon they were all singing "Be Still My Soul," their voices blending in the lamplit room. Nora's clear soprano carried the melody, while Boaz's deep bass provided the foundation, just as their partnership anchored the ranch itself. Outside, the storm clouds finally parted completely, revealing a sky full of stars. The last notes of the hymn faded into peaceful silence, a different kind of quiet than the storm's heavy hush. It was the quiet of hearts at rest, of burdens shared and grace received. Boaz reached for Nora's hand across the table, and she squeezed it gently. The confession that had weighed so heavily on him now seemed lighter, transformed by understanding into another thread, binding them together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the strength of this new, unshakable bond between them. The others gradually drifted out to the bunkhouse, leaving Boaz and Nora alone in the peaceful kitchen. The stove's warmth and the familiar scents of coffee and wood smoke wrapped around them like a blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for now they had this moment of perfect calm. The storm passed, both outside and within. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle watercolors when hoofbeats thundered into the ranch yard. The sound scattered the chickens and brought Boaz to the door, coffee cup still in hand. Nora looked up from where she was kneading bread dough at the kitchen table, her fingers dusted white with flour. Through the window, they watched Silas Fitch dismount his sleek bay horse, followed by Deputy Eli Boone and two rough-looking hired men. The morning sun caught the deputy's badge, sending sharp glints across the yard. Eli's face was drawn tight, his usual easy manner replaced by something more rigid and uncomfortable. Fitch's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, waving a sheet of paper like a battle flag. His city clothes looked out of place against the weathered ranch buildings, but his smile held the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "McAllister!" Fitch called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Got ourselves a final inspection order here. Time to settle this business once and for all." Boaz stepped onto the porch, his tall frame filling the doorway. He kept his hands visible and relaxed at his sides, though his eyes never left the two hired men who flanked Fitch. Their hands hovered near their gun belts, and the morning light caught the dull gleam of well-worn single-action revolvers. Deputy Eli stepped forward, accepting the paper from Fitch with obvious reluctance. His eyes scanned the document, and the muscle in his jaw tightened. "This appears to be an order, but—" He hesitated, clearly wrestling with something. Nora emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She moved to stand beside Boaz, her presence steady and calm. The morning breeze carried the scent of her rising bread dough, a homey contrast to the tension crackling in the air. Fitch strode towards the stable, his polished boots leaving sharp prints in the dust. "We'll start with an inventory of livestock and equipment," he announced, reaching for the stable latch. Boaz moved then, crossing the yard in long strides to position himself between Fitch and the stable door. He made no aggressive moves, kept his hands clearly visible, but his presence was unmistakable. "No, sir," he said quietly. "Not today." The hired men responded instantly, their thumbs drawing back the hammers of their revolvers. The sound cut through the morning air like insect clicks, sharp and threatening. Eli's hand moved to his own weapon, but uncertainty showed in his eyes. Nora's clear voice rang out across the yard, quoting scripture with quiet authority. "Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other." The familiar words of the psalm seemed to hover in the air, making even Fitch pause. Deputy Eli squared his shoulders, something shifting in his expression. "Hold on now," he said, stepping between Fitch and Boaz. "Judge Merriweather was clear about no eviction actions pending his final ruling. This inspection order doesn't override that." "Now see here, Deputy," Fitch began, his face flushing red, but the sudden thunder of approaching hoofbeats cut him off. A boy on a lathered horse burst into the yard, the telegraph company's signature yellow envelope clutched in his hand. "Message for McAllister Ranch!" he shouted, practically tumbling from his saddle in his haste. "Urgent wire from the State Land Office." Eli took the telegram, breaking the seal with careful deliberation. His eyes widened slightly as he read, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well now," he said, looking up at Fitch. "Seems the state office has some concerns about Mr. Birch's deed. They're flagging it as suspect." He paused, letting the words sink in. They also confirmed McAllister's original filings were submitted well within the required time frame. The color drained from Fitch's face. The hired men shifted uneasily, their hands dropping away from their weapons. "Under the circumstances," Eli continued, his voice firmer now, I'm ordering you and your men off this property, Mr. Fitch. Any further action will have to wait for the judge's final ruling. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. For a moment, Fitch stood rigid, his face working through several shades of red. Then he spun on his heel, storming back to his horse. The hired men followed, trying to maintain their threatening demeanor but looking more like scolded schoolboys. As they mounted up, Ben Yazzie emerged silently from behind the barn, swinging onto his own horse. He would follow them at a distance, making sure they truly left and noting where they went. His skills as a scout would ensure they never knew they were being watched. The thunder of departing hooves faded into the morning quiet. The telegraph boy accepted a glass of water and a penny for his trouble before racing back to town, clearly thrilled to have been part of such dramatic proceedings. Nora disappeared into the house, returning moments later with paper and pen. She sat at the kitchen table, carefully composing a note of thanks to the telegraph operator, whose swift delivery had proved so crucial. Her handwriting was neat and precise, despite the slight trembling in her fingers. When she finished, she took the telegram and opened the family Bible that rested on the sideboard. With gentle fingers, she secured the yellow paper in the Bible's flyleaf, smoothing it carefully into place. The state's confirmation of their rightful claim would rest there between the records of births, deaths, and marriages, another piece of their story preserved. Boaz watched her from the doorway, his expression soft. Neither of them needed to say how close they'd come to violence, or how grateful they were that wisdom and patience had prevailed. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in golden beams, while outside the chickens gradually returned to their pecking, and the ranch settled back into its peaceful rhythm. Ben returned an hour later, reporting that Fitch and his men had ridden straight back to town, their posturing gone, their schemes unraveling in the face of official documentation and steadfast truth. The morning's confrontation had passed without a single shot fired, proved again that courage didn't always need a gun to make its point. Nora returned to her bread dough, which had risen perfectly during all the excitement. The familiar work of punching it down and shaping the loaves helped steady her hands, though her heart was already at peace. The telegram in the Bible was more than just a legal victory. It was confirmation that their path of patience and principle had been the right one all along. The courthouse buzzed with tension as noon approached. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above the wooden benches. Nora smoothed her best dress, a serviceable brown wool that had seen better days, but still held its dignity. Beside her, Boaz sat straight-backed in his Sunday coat, his large hands resting quiet on his knees. Judge Thaddeus Merriweather settled into his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His weathered face gave nothing away as he adjusted his spectacles and lifted a yellow telegram form from his desk. The crowded room fell silent, waiting. "I have here," the judge began, his voice carrying to every corner, "a response from the State Land Office regarding the deed presented by Notary Birch." He paused, his eyes scanning the document. "The seal on this corrected deed has been examined and found to be fraudulent." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Silas Fitch shifted in his chair, his collar suddenly seeming too tight. Beside him, Notary Caleb Birch's face had gone pale as fresh whitewash. "Mr. Birch," Judge Merriweather called, "approach the bench." The notary rose on shaking legs. Behind him, Harlan Dodd edged closer to the side door, his eyes darting between the judge and the exit. "Would you care to explain how a forged seal came to be on this document?" The judge's voice was quiet but carried steel beneath its calm. Birch gripped the rail before him, sweat beading on his forehead. I... He glanced at Fitch, who glared back with naked threat in his eyes. "Remember, sir, that perjury carries severe consequences," the judge warned. "Particularly for a notary public." Something broke in Birch's face. His shoulders slumped as though a great weight had settled upon them. "Banker Fitch," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He paid me to backdate the filings." The words came faster now, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "He wanted me to draft that notice about Mrs. McAllister's age disqualifying the marriage, said it would pressure them to sell, promised me a percentage when the railroad came through." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Dodd took another step towards the door, but the judge's sharp voice froze him in place. "Mr. Dodd, remain where you are. Your involvement in this matter will be addressed shortly." Reverend Josiah Bell rose from his seat, his Bible clutched firmly in his hands. The judge nodded, and the preacher approached the front of the court. "Reverend Bell, please restate your testimony regarding the marriage ceremony." The minister's voice rang clear and true as he recounted the public vows exchanged in the town square. He detailed the proper recording of the marriage in his register, the witnesses present, and the immediate filing of notices. Ben Yazzie followed, his testimony measured and precise. He described the years of improvements Boaz had made to the land, irrigation ditches dug by hand, boundary markers maintained through harsh winters, careful management of the spring's flow to benefit downstream neighbors. The fort's records confirm regular supply contracts with McAllister Ranch dating back 5 years. Ben added, indicating a stack of army receipts. When Nora's turn came, she rose with quiet grace. Her voice never wavered as she explained her bookkeeping methods, the careful records she'd maintained even through the hardest times at her boarding house. The judge nodded approvingly at her methodical presentation of dates and documents. Judge Merriweather removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly as he considered. The room held its breath. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony," he announced, "this court finds as follows: the marriage between Boaz McAllister and Nora Whitfield. McAllister is valid and properly recorded. The original water and land filings submitted by Mr. McAllister are confirmed as timely and legitimate." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "The temporary injunction is hereby dissolved as void." Relief broke across Nora's face like sunrise. Boaz reached for her hand, his fingers gentle against hers. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate warrant for the arrest of Silas Fitch on charges of fraud and coercion." Fitch bolted. He shoved past Dodd and crashed through the side door, his footsteps thundering down the wooden stairs outside. Deputy Eli Boone cursed colorfully, then touched his hat in apology to Nora. "Pardon my language, ma'am." He turned toward the door, but Boaz was already on his feet. "Your Honor," Boaz said, his voice respectful but urgent. "Request permission to assist the deputy as a civilian." The judge studied him for a moment, noting the steady calm in the big man's eyes. He nodded once, sharply. "Granted, Mr. McAllister. But mind you follow Deputy Boone's lead." Nora stood as Boaz turned to go. She caught his hand, her fingers strong despite their trembling. "Come back in peace," she said softly, years of prayer in her voice. Boaz squeezed her hand once, then followed Eli through the door. Their boots pounded down the stairs as they raced for the livery where their horses waited. Ben Yazzie slipped from the courthouse like a shadow. He swung onto his horse with fluid grace, ready to track Fitch's trail without raising telltale dust. His skills as a scout would prove invaluable in what was to come. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as horses' hooves thundered down the main street, carrying justice in their wake. Left behind in the courthouse, Nora lifted her face to the light streaming through the windows, her heart full of thanksgiving and hope that peace would indeed prevail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as 3 riders followed the arroyo's winding path. Ben Yazzie led the way, studying tracks in the loose soil with practiced eyes. Deputy Eli Boone and Boaz McAllister rode behind him, letting their horses maintain a steady, ground-covering pace. "No need to founder good horseflesh," Ben commented, pointing to fresh wheel marks. Wagon headed toward the railroad camp. Not more than an hour ahead. They kept to the track, dust coating their boots and clothes. The measured pursuit gave Boaz time to reflect on how different this was from his younger days. No reckless charge, no burning need for confrontation. Just the quiet certainty of justice taking its proper course. Smoke from the railroad grading camp rose ahead of them. Workers looked up as they rode in, tools falling silent. Harlan Dodd emerged from a canvas tent, his face draining of color when he spotted the lawmen. Near the camp's edge, Silas Fitch spun around at the sound of approaching hooves. His hand darted toward his holster. "Easy now," Boaz said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet camp. "Single-action revolver's a mighty particular weapon. Man who draws too quick often lives to regret it. If he lives." Deputy Boone kept his Colt trained steady. "I've got a warrant here, Mr. Fitch." Best surrender peaceful-like. The fight seemed to drain from Fitch's body. His shoulders slumped as he slowly drew his pistol, using just 2 fingers, holding it out grip first. Eli moved forward, holstering his own weapon to secure the cuffs. He read the warrant in a clear voice, while workers watched from a respectful distance. "I'll cooperate with the investigation," Dodd announced, mopping his brow. "We'll pull up those survey stakes near McAllister Spring first thing tomorrow." Ben rode ahead to inform Judge Merriweather while the others escorted Fitch back to town. They traveled at an easy walk, the sunset painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose. A small crowd gathered on the boardwalk as Eli led his prisoner into the jail. Boaz watched until the door closed, then turned his horse toward home. The ranch house windows glowed with welcome lamplight when he arrived. He dismounted, muscles tired from the long day in the saddle. Inside, he hung his hat on its familiar peg and let out a long breath. His hands were empty, but his heart was full. Golden autumn sunlight spilled across the McAllister ranch yard as neighbors gathered for a Thanksgiving supper. The air carried the rich scent of roasting venison, which Levi and Tom had been tending since dawn. Covered dishes and fresh-baked pies crowded every available surface on the long outdoor tables. Reverend Bell stood on the porch steps, holding up an official envelope from the county seat. "Listen here, everyone," he called out, unfolding the crisp paper. His clear voice carried across the yard as he read the recorded deed and water rights certificate, making it official at last. Nora squeezed Boaz's hand, her heart full. Harlan Dodd, looking humbled and thoughtful, stepped forward to sign a settlement document. His pen scratched against the paper as he promised. In writing to keep all railroad survey lines clear of McAllister Spring. The tension that had gripped the community began to dissolve like morning mist. Ben Yazzie raised his hands and offered a traditional Diné blessing for harmony between the land and its people. Reverend Bell followed with a prayer of thanksgiving, their different traditions weaving together in peaceful respect. Under the shade of a cottonwood tree, Nora sat surrounded by children, teaching them to piece together cloth squares for a new church quilt. Little Ruthie, her cheeks glowing with health, nestled against her father Tom's leg, and giggled as she pushed her needle through the fabric. The sweet notes of a fiddle drew everyone's attention to the porch, where Boaz had begun playing "Shall We Gather at the River." His boot tapped steadily against the wooden boards, and soon others joined in, voices rising in harmony as the sun began its slow descent. Deputy Eli Boone approached Nora, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, I need to apologize proper for that night I brought the notice," he said quietly. "It wasn't right." "You were doing your duty," Nora replied warmly, touching his arm. "And in the end, you stood for truth. That's what matters now." As lanterns began to glow in the gathering dusk, Boaz set aside his fiddle and drew Nora close on the porch. Remember what they said? He murmured. That you were too old to marry? Nora looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes but joy in her smile. Not for you, she whispered. The windows of their home glowed with warmth and welcome, a beacon of their second chance made permanent at last. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.